Well, thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. Thank you for such an auspicious introduction. I don't consider myself to be part of an elite group, but it's really good to be here, and it's good to see so many people out on a Saturday morning. Wow. Don't adjust your television sets. This is a Scottish accent. I just always have to preface my talk with that little comment. I'm always reminded when I speak in front of a new audience. You can all understand me, yeah? Right, okay. I'm always reminded when I speak in front of a new audience of my first kind of teaching gig outside of the UK, which was in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I'd given it was really one of my first teaching jobs. And I'd given my first week of lectures to undergraduates when I was summoned to the Dean's office, who sat me, a very nice chap, and sat me down and says, look, Chris, he says, we love you. He says, we love the combination, whatever that meant. We love the combination. But the students don't understand what you're saying. And could you perhaps be a little less Billy Connolly and a bit more Sean Connery when you're delivering your accent? I'm really glad you laughed at that, because I made the mistake of telling that little story to an undergraduate class and nobody laughed. And he approached me afterwards and said, who's Billy Connolly? Who's Sean Connery? So we're all in the same age group, which is great. So as was just said, I arrived in Canada in January 2016, and really I arrived knowing nothing about Canada, which was quite an exciting opportunity for me. And I arrived as Canada Research Chair to establish a 5-country programme looking at the reception of refugees, and those reception contexts are basically, it's Jordan, Canada, the US, Greece and Italy. And what we're doing there is we're looking at various aspects of how refugee resettlement takes place, the various barriers, challenges that arise within various national responses to what gets called the refugee crisis. And I'm going to talk about work that we've done since 2016, which focuses specifically on Canada. Just going back to my newcomer status. So I arrived in January 2016, which was the same time that a lot of the sort of public profile around refugee reception, especially around the Syrian refugee issue, was being publicised in the press. And I was really amazed by just how much attention this issue was getting. I was also amazed by a couple of other things, which, first of all, a tremendous response on the part of Canadians to the reception of Syrian refugees, primarily around what I've been looking at, and that's private sponsorship, the private sponsorship scheme, which is, up till now, has been pretty unique to Canada. It doesn't really exist anywhere else. And so I was quite amazed. So I kind of arrived at the same time and was following all the news, the publicity in the news around the reception of Syrian refugees. And at the same time, the Federal Department of Immigration and the Social Science and Humanities Research Council put out a call for rapid response research to look specifically at what was happening with the reception of Syrian refugees. And my team was very lucky in that we were one of the groups we got funding from SHRC and from the Department of Immigration to do some work over a year, very quickly, looking at various aspects of resettlement and, excuse me, the integration, let's call it the integration of refugees in Canada. And one of the main discourses in the press was around the idea that the private sponsorship scheme, which I'll go into a little bit, had been tremendously successful. And it was going to be exported to 14 or 15 different other countries, at least that was the aim at the time. And so I was very struck by this idea of resettlement success. What constitutes successful resettlement? We went out and we carried out interviews with privately sponsored Syrian refugees and private sponsorship groups. And we very much orientated the research around what constitutes successful resettlement. It seems like an obvious question, but it's not because you'll find that when you speak to people who have been sponsored, they have one conception of what successful resettlement is, and the people who are doing the sponsoring may indeed have another concept of what successful resettlement is. And when you interview government and government officials, service providers, they in turn can have a third idea of what successful resettlement is, and they don't necessarily merge. They can conflict. So we began to look at that, and I want to talk about what we identified as one of the core aspects of what kind of underpins successful resettlement, and it comes down to trust. So to give you an idea of what we initially found, here are two very different responses from sponsored Syrian refugees that we spoke to. Now, if you have a look at this, the first one: we love this city and we do not want to go away from our sponsors as we consider them like family. Very positive, yeah. The second one: the sponsor does not know our needs. I did not expect that my sponsorship program would be so bad. If I knew that in advance, I would have preferred to stay in Lebanon. I will not advise anyone to come here. Now, they're ostensibly diametrically opposed responses from Syrian refugees. And there was this kind of polarity then between persons who had had a very positive experience and persons who had a very negative experience, and shades of grey in between. So we wanted to understand why, what's going on here, because it's not obvious, right? And that's what we did. So we went in to basically understand why it was that some refugees were refusing to resettle, such that we interviewed one family who actually returned to Lebanon. They went back. They didn't want to stay. But we also interviewed families and individuals who absolutely loved it here. And we had to kind of work out why. Nobody knows, right? Nobody knew why this, nobody had uncovered this previous to this research. So as I said, we orientated our research around this sort of idea of successful resettlement. And what we noticed when we were talking to sponsored refugees is that their narrative, the way they explained their experiences, were very much constructed around what we called events of significance. And these events of significance, events that had an impact on them, weren't located primarily just within Canada after they had arrived. These events of significance had occurred prior to arrival. So when they talk about what constitutes success, they move beyond the reception context of Canada. They go right back and they talk about their experiences of coming through conflict. Some of them going to camps, not all, but some who went to camps initially, and then finding out about the private sponsorship scheme, what it entailed, and going through the process of coming to Canada. So their events of significance then, significant to successful resettlement, didn't actually always, they weren't orientated around the experience of being in Canada, but how they drew on their experiences of coming through conflict. Excuse me again. Here's a quote. So I try to think like a refugee, but I don't know how. Now, this was a quote from a 46-year-old woman from Aleppo. And what she was saying here was, I've come to Canada, and there are a certain set of expectations around what a refugee is, how a refugee should behave, etc., etc. And I don't know how to do that. Right? I don't know how to do that. And those expectations can very much come from the sponsor group as well. And I'll go into this a bit more over the duration of the talk. But really what she was talking about, and when she went back to her experiences of going through conflict, what she was saying was that, I'm a 46-year-old woman. I had a life before the conflict. I had a family, a husband, etc., etc., jobs, communities, I was a person. And in my life, I made decisions. And those decisions were either successful or they weren't, but they were my decisions to make, yeah? Or my family's, in consultation with my family. And this was replicated, this kind of response was replicated right across the sort of board of all the people that we spoke to. And what they were saying was that, what we deduced from this was that they were saying in their experience of conflict, the forces of conflict, actually what they're saying, what they're doing, is they're telling me, I do not have the eligibility to exist. The forces of conflict are trying to take my eligibility to exist away. They're saying, we're going to destroy you. We're going to annihilate you. Yeah? You do not have the eligibility to exist as a person. And the experience of coming through that and getting through that was very much self-confirmation that I have the eligibility to exist, that I have defied the disconfirming forces of conflict. I've defied those conflict forces which said to me, I have no right to exist. And I defied it by utilizing all the skills and abilities I'd had prior to the conflict. As a mother, as a wife, as a single person, as a brother, as a sister, etc., etc. I used all of these roles and these deliberative process strategies. You know, right, should we move to Lebanon first? No, let's go to Jordan first. It's safer there. We've got some family here, you know, and decisions that are made, which actually, when you put them all together, allow persons going through conflict to formulate what we called a way of self-rescue. They had rescued themselves and formulated a way, a group, whether that be around their family, friends, neighbours, persons they'd met along the way. So here's an example of how that works. In Zatari camp in Jordan, one woman, a Muslim woman, said to us, I had to sell my gold. I had to sell my gold so that my family could survive in the camp. We didn't have the ability to buy gas, etc., all the things that we needed, and I had to sell my gold. Now, when somebody hears that, they think, a refugee with gold, right? But actually, in Muslim custom, the mahar, where the bride is gifted gold in advance of marriage, yeah, actually bestows a certain authority to act, right, in the event of catastrophe, in the event of an an oncoming catastrophe. It could be divorce. It could be any kind of breakdown that would be considered to be catastrophic. She's entitled to sell her gold in order to survive, yeah? And that's what she did. So in doing that, she drew on her pre-conflict eligibilities in order to demonstrate her own authority to act in order to save herself and her family, yeah? Well, that's very crucial. And something that's kind of overlooked, I think, when people think about refugees. So what we came up with was a whole new conceptual framework to try and understand successful actions which came into play during resettlement. And we developed a concept called status eligibilities. And these status eligibilities incorporate two aspects: the eligibility to exist and the authority to act. So when somebody is given the status of refugee when they come into Canada, what they're bringing with them is a prior historical knowledge of their own status eligibilities. I have the eligibility to exist and the authority to act, and not necessarily as a refugee, but as someone who had a life prior to conflict. And I want my life back, or at least I want aspects of my life back that I lost. So when she's saying, I try to think like a refugee, but I don't know how, what she's saying is, I have the eligibility to exist. and the authority to act as a person. Yeah? So coming on to what we then call existential transactions of worth. What we found was that looking at sponsor groups and the sponsor-sponsored relationship and what had happened in that relationship, a number of sponsor groups had engaged in contact with the persons they were sponsoring prior to them leaving wherever it was they were, whether it be Lebanon, Jordan. And they'd done this, either through Facebook, through Skype, text messages, email, etc., etc. So, for example, one sponsor group had gone to great lengths and had sent 5 photographs of 5 different apartments. And they'd said, here are 5 different apartments. We could potentially rent any of these for you. Which one do you like? Which one do you like? If you move to this area, your kids can go to there are 3 schools that your kids could go to. If they go to school A, they won't have access to the same degree of English language learning that we'll have if they go to group B, school B, school C. Now, the refugees that we spoke to had had that experience, were overwhelmed at the fact that they had been recognised as human beings in advance of them coming to Canada. We couldn't believe it, one person said to us. Couldn't believe it, that they were giving us choices, right? Choices in advance of coming. And what that was, what was actually happening there was that the sponsor groups who did that were recognising that these persons had a life prior to coming to Canada. And when they did that, and when they recognised, and they sometimes through a third party, mediated via an Arabic speaker over telephone, without any visual contact, when they did that, it instilled a sense of trust. What do we mean by that? Well, people who come through conflict develop a practical identity, right? What do we have to practically have to do to get through this? And as I said, I described before, the use resources from their life, skills, abilities, etc., etc., a practical identity. So when this kind of choice, informational choice, is presented, the refugees' experience of uncertainty is reduced because they've never come to Canada, they don't know what to expect when they come to Canada. They don't know what's going to see it on the news, etc., but they don't know what's waiting for them when they come to Canada. So when these sponsors put down these choices and say, we're recognising that you're a human being and have a practical identity and are able to make choices and the right to decide, which type of house you'd prefer to live in, right? Okay. The way in which the refugees interpret where they're coming to changes. It changes how they interpret it, how they interpret the resettlement context of Canada. And it also changes the expectations of resettlement. And it does that by reducing the unknowable element. And those 3 parts, interpretation and expectation and uncertainty, the reduction of uncertainty, are 3 common elements of what we call trust. That's how trust develops between human beings, sociologically speaking. So when they did that, the sponsors and the sponsored developed a we of trusted contact. So the we of self-rescue developed in the conflict zone when interacting with sponsors became a we of trusted contact. We trust them. They trust us, we trust them. And this orientates somebody's subjective understanding, the relationship to the context they're coming to, so that when you arrive, you already have in advance some kind of subjective interpretation and expectation of what's going to happen when you get there. The sponsor-sponsored relationships that broke down hadn't had that pre-arrival contact. People had arrived at Pearson Airport to a placard, very nice, but knew nothing about the person holding the placard. And that sets up the relationship in advance. So the ones who had more difficulty, and the ones, I'll come back to this, the second quote, the negative quote, were the ones who hadn't had a developed experience of pre-arrival trusted contact. And that affected the way in which they orientated themselves in terms of language, community, their mobility. So for example, even where it was the case where refugees couldn't speak English, that didn't necessarily become a barrier to them thinking that their resettlement had been successful, because it had this trusted contact, and it continued over the resettlement period of 12 months, where the interaction with sponsors recognised that they are persons of self-rescue. So let's talk a little bit more about what I call resettlement knowledge assets. So resettlement knowledge assets are very different to resettlement information. When somebody, the Canadian government has pre-arrival information sessions in embassies in Lebanon, for example, where people who get private sponsorship can go along and get information about Canada. But information is very different to knowledge, and here's an example of why. There are many sources of resettlement information. So for example, Justin Trudeau on the news, standing at Pearson Airport, giving out jackets and things. That's a source of information, resettlement information. People see that and they're informed. There are other sources of information. So sponsor groups get sources of resettlement information from the government, policy, what are the expectations, etc., etc. But those sources of information are not knowledge resettlement assets. They do not orientate the relationship between host and refugee around trust. They're just sources of information. People can interpret those sources of information in many different ways. So for example, I remember jokingly one refugee, a male, said, you know, we turned up at Pearson and Justin Trudeau wasn't there. You know, where's my Canada Goose jacket? And actually, he was semi-serious, you know, he'd been disappointed, he was disappointed. But that's not resettlement knowledge. Knowledge exchange occurs when uncertainty is suspended. So when those sponsor groups were engaging with the sponsored refugees and saying, you know, what do you prefer for your 5-year-old son, a Spider-Man bed or a Batman bed? Yeah? Now, to many that's like, oh, imagine that, a refugee would care about that, right? But actually, people who have lost everything care even more about that. Because I have a 7-year-old son, right? And these are the everyday decisions that you make as a parent with your everyday normal things that encapsulate your experience as a human being, yeah? And there's no reason why a 46-year-old, tell you my age, a 46-year-old father from Syria, and you know, from Syria, wouldn't like to have the ability to make that decision. Again, decisions that they made. It might not have been Batman and Spider-Man, it might have been something else. But you know what I mean? Everyday decisions around parenting. When that happened, pre-arrival, and continued to happen after arrival, the uncertainty of coming to Canada as a refugee was suspended. It was narrowed, it was reduced. The trust developed between both parties. And you got that quote at the beginning, these sponsors are a new family for life. Yeah? We love it here. When that didn't happen, when it was just based on sources of information, which can be right or wrong, yeah? Justin Trudeau's not going to be at the airport waiting for you, right? It can be right or wrong. When it's based on that, there's no prior relationship predicated on trust. So in that relationship then, what there is an acknowledgement of worth, an acknowledgement that you have the eligibility to exist, your existence, you have the right to exist, and you have the authority to act and to make decisions. When that's recognised, that there was a life before refuge and potentially a life after refuge, you get the development of existential transactions of worth. That's what they are. Transactions around existence, around confirming your right to your eligibility to exist. And that informs the types of information and the types of contact and the depth and degree of contact which exists between two persons who have never met, who are going to be living in very close and quite intense conditions for 12 months after resettlement. When that happens, you get the exchange of knowledge, of resettlement knowledge assets. So looking at this process of private sponsorship then, we were looking at refugee-host relations, but when you think about this, this is human relations. We engage on an everyday basis on existential transactions of worth. Are you worthy? Do I talk to you in a way that makes you feel that I think you're worthy? Or do I dismiss you? I say, I don't care. Do I do it? So actually, by looking at refugee-host relations, we're able to develop an understanding of how human beings actually work and orientate themselves on a daily basis. People who are not refugees, And that's why this kind of works as a conceptual framework. And really the essence of this is that they were saying that this is what we encapsulate what happens in Canada around the reception of Syrian refugees by acknowledging that there's a life before refuge. We acknowledge that there's a life beyond refuge. And that's what persons of self-rescue want. Yeah? So what have we done with this elaborate conceptual framework? It's not been for nothing. We've developed something called SMART, the Social Mobilities Alliance for Refuge, Trust and Transition. So I've been giving these talks now for the last 6 to 7 months around the world, in Canada, and we were approached by a private sector company called Shore in Toronto, who had developed a peer-to-peer online platform for the Department of Education in Manitoba to facilitate contact and exchange of information. And we went into discussion with them, and we're going to use that. They've given us it to use it. They've given us 1.3 million to extend this and expand this to develop it for refugee-host relations. So what we're doing is a five-year development project. The SMART platform. The SMART platform will enable us to systematize those ad hoc pre-arrival contact. The pre-arrival contact I was talking about through Facebook, Skype, etc. It's very ad hoc. Some get it, some don't. Some do it, some don't. It's very difficult. What we're going to do is systematize that and give all sponsorship groups the ability to engage in pre-arrival contact. A platform, the SMART platform, which will enable them through pointers and probes around different types of information exchange to speak on a one-to-one basis in English and have it translated into Arabic, vice versa. To develop pre-arrival trust so that when people come, it has a significant impact on someone's ability to resettle. It also has a significant impact on the sponsor groups, the people in Canada who've gone to great lengths to try and help. So SMART then, we just got money for a pilot project to do that from the eCampus Ontario Fund. We've applied to the Ontario Research Excellent Fund for another $1 million. And I'm going to see the Department of Immigration on Wednesday, and they don't know this yet, so don't tell them. I'm going to ask them for another $1 million. And hopefully they go for this, because this actually is, it's a development of what we call socially engaged technologies. So it's a technological development premised on concrete empirical findings, which will have a dynamic effect on the ability of the federal government to implement its policy around resettlement. So I'll give you just one indication of how this will affect the private sponsorship scheme. While at present, some sponsor groups engage in ad hoc pre-arrival knowledge exchange, private sponsorship groups have to, when they form the group of 5 volunteers, they have to raise enough monies to be able to support people for 12 months. And those monies include monies for rent, clothing, etc., etc. What we want to do is place within the policy framework an obligation to communicate, such that a little part of that money, just a little part, not a lot, means that they can facilitate the online access for the people who are coming. And they can facilitate Smart's going to develop in such a way that if you can send a text, and mobile phones are one of the last things relinquished by someone who's going through refuge. If you can send a text, you'll be able to use Smart, but you might not be able to get online access. So as soon as you engage with a private sponsorship group, they should be in a position to facilitate the funding of their online access so that they can actually communicate. It'll cost pretty much nothing to do it. So that will affect the development of the policy. At the moment the policy at a federal level doesn't have that component, our work affects that policy. It makes it better. It improves the policy, and it improves the experience of refugees and Canadians in the process. If you can increase trust, there's work that's been done which suggests that trust has an impact on GDP. If you can increase trust in society, if a society has a greater degree of trust, its GDP increases. Use of health services changes. The impact on mental health is affected by the degree of trust in the society. So Smart then, it's not just an application that you download onto your mobile and show to your friends, right? It actually has crucial and significant consequences for our ability to improve people's lives. At least that's the hope. So what we're doing here then at York, and myself as Canada Research Chair, is trying to find ways in which we can improve people's lives. And I think, if you think about it, the grant that we actually got to do that work from IRCC and from SHRC was $25,000. They gave us $25,000 and we interviewed 109 people in 3 months, developed this framework, and have come out with Smart. So we worked dynamically, we worked fast, we saw an issue, a problem, and we decided to solve it. And that's what good socially engaged research is. And my Canada Research Chair is about socially engaged research and how to improve people's lives. One last point. Sponsor groups in Canada, some of them really amazing things, right? It's humbling. I couldn't do it. It's like putting together a group of 5 people, raising $25,000, $30,000, facilitating the movement of a family into Canada, helping them try and get on. It's not an easy task. And some of them had real problems. Some of them fell apart. Sponsor groups can collapse. We don't want that. We want to be able to improve that. And the reason why many of them collapsed was because there was an absence of the recognition of autonomy of the person of self within that group, such that, here's something you might not like. One gentleman, refugee, a smoker, says, they refused to allow me to smoke, right? They refused to allow me to smoke. And they said, one said, we're not giving you money to buy cigarettes. But someone else in that sponsor group disagreed and says, no, actually, it's not our right. This is their money. If he wants to spend it on that, that's his decision. He's an adult, that's his decision. And that created a problem for some within the group. So what you get there is an imbalance on how you recognise someone's autonomy as an adult, as a human being. Do they have the right to make decisions on their own? Or do we make them for them? Where it broke down, where the relationship broke down, was when there was an imposition placed on the people that didn't match their expectations. When the expectation and interpretation of resettlement was more closely aligned to what actually goes on here, they didn't have those problems. So again, it came back to pre-arrival communication, the exchange of knowledge resettlement assets, and the recognition that these persons require existential transactions of worth. Thank you.